On August 3rd, 1985, 15-year-old Emily Carter left her home in Cedar Ridge, Texas, to walk to a nearby convenience store. It was a trip she had made dozens of times before. Just a short walk, no more than 10 minutes each way. Cedar Ridge was a quiet, family-friendly town, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. Emily was a bright, outgoing teenager, known for her kindness and love of reading. She had plans to meet friends later that afternoon, and she was excited about an upcoming school year. She never came home. At first, her mother wasn't too concerned. Maybe Emily had stopped at a friend's house or lost track of time. But as minutes turned into hours, that worry turned into dread. She called Emily's friends, neighbors, and the store, but no one had seen her. By nightfall, Emily's mother called the police. She knew something was wrong, but she had no idea that her daughter had already met a fate too horrifying to imagine. As the Texas sun dipped below the horizon, the streets of Cedar Ridge grew quiet, but inside the Carter household, panic had set in. Emily's mother, Linda Carter, had spent the past 2 hours calling every friend and neighbor she could think of. No one had seen Emily. Her father, Mark Carter, drove the streets of their neighborhood, stopping at gas stations, parks, and the convenience store where she had been headed. When he walked inside, the store clerk shook his head. She was here earlier around 3:30 p.m., I think. She bought a soda and some candy. Then she left. That was it. No sign of distress. No suspicious figures following her. Nothing. Emily had walked out of that store and vanished. By 9 p.m., Linda picked up the phone and dialed 911. My daughter is missing. She left for the store this afternoon, and she never came home. The dispatcher took down the details, but there was no immediate sense of urgency. Emily was a teenager. Maybe she had run off. Maybe she was with friends. But Linda knew her daughter. Emily would never just disappear. And in her gut, she knew something terrible had happened. By 10 p.m., a patrol car pulled into the Carter family's driveway. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions calm but serious. They had taken hundreds of missing persons calls before. Most of the time, it was just a misunderstanding. A teenager sneaking out, staying late with friends, or just needing space. But Linda Carter was adamant. Emily wouldn't just leave. She had plans. She promised she'd be home. The officers took down a description of Emily, her height, weight, what she was wearing, and asked for a recent photo. Then they headed to the convenience store, retracing Emily's last known steps. The store clerk confirmed she had been there at 3:30 p.m., just as her father had learned earlier. She walked out the front door. That was the last I saw her. Police canvassed the area, knocking on doors, stopping pedestrians, asking if anyone had seen the teenage girl. But no one had. Emily had seemingly vanished into thin air. By midnight, officers expanded their search radius, calling in additional patrols to drive through back roads, empty parking lots, and nearby parks. Still nothing. It wasn't until the next morning that the case would take a darker turn, because by then, Emily was already gone. The next morning, as the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, the town was already on high alert. Emily Carter had been missing for nearly 18 hours, and a search party had formed. Neighbors, police officers, and volunteers combing through streets, parks, and wooded areas. At 8:17 a.m., a local jogger named Robert Mason was running his usual route along a wooded shortcut near the main road when something caught his eye. A bright-colored fabric, partially hidden in the tall grass. As he stepped closer, his stomach dropped. It was a body. The police were on the scene within minutes. What they found was every parent's worst nightmare. Emily Carter's lifeless body lay in the field, partially concealed by overgrown grass and brush. She had been stabbed multiple times, her clothing torn and disheveled. Clear signs that this had been a brutal and calculated attack. But it wasn't just the violence of the crime that disturbed investigators. Emily was still wearing all of her jewelry, except for one item. Her pearl ring was missing. Was it taken as a trophy? Had the killer kept it as a reminder? And most haunting of all, how had no one seen or heard anything? Emily had been found less than a mile from her home, in an area where people walked every day. Yet not a single witness had come forward. And now, police knew one thing for certain. Somewhere in Cedar Ridge, a killer was walking free. And he wasn't finished yet. Despite happening in broad daylight, Emily Carter's murder had no witnesses, or at least none who had come forward. The field where her body was found was located between two residential streets, often used as a shortcut by teenagers and locals heading to the nearby store. People walked this path every single day. Yet no one reported hearing screams. No one saw a struggle. No one noticed anything out of the ordinary. Police began working on a theory. Had Emily been followed from the store? Had she known her killer and willingly walked into the field with them? Or had the killer been waiting, lurking in the tall grass, watching for the perfect opportunity to strike? The lack of evidence was frustrating. There were no surveillance cameras, no footprints leading away from the crime scene, and no murder weapon left behind. What they did have was DNA, collected from Emily's body, but in 1985, forensic science was still in its infancy. There was no way to identify the killer through DNA testing at the time. Detectives shifted their focus to suspect profiling. Was the murderer a stranger who attacked at random? Or was this someone Emily knew? A person she trusted enough to follow into an empty field? The missing pearl ring complicated things. If robbery wasn't the motive, then why steal just one item? Was it a trophy? A keepsake? A sign of something more sinister? All investigators knew was that whoever had done this had gotten away clean. And for now, they were one step ahead of the police. With no immediate suspects, police turned to the most common strategy in cases like this. They started looking at men in Emily Carter's life. Friends, neighbors, teachers, anyone she might have interacted with. One name quickly stood out: Brian Lawson. Brian was 19 years old, a former neighbor of the Carters, and had once been friendly with Emily. They weren't close, but he had spoken to her on multiple occasions, and some classmates recalled Emily mentioning his name before. Brian had a quiet reputation. Some described him as socially awkward. Others said he was withdrawn, but harmless. But there was one red flag that police fixated on. When they asked Brian for a DNA sample, he refused. To investigators, this was suspicious behavior. Why would an innocent man refuse to help clear his name? Brian quickly became the primary suspect. His family and friends started to distance themselves, and whispers began spreading in the small town. Was he the one who followed Emily that day? Did he snap and kill her out of rejected affection? The truth? Brian had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. Years later, once DNA testing had advanced, police tested Brian's DNA against the sample found on Emily's body. It wasn't a match. By then, his life had already been ruined. Despite being innocent, Brian never received an apology from law enforcement. For years, he lived under a cloud of suspicion, losing friends, relationships, and opportunities because of a crime he never committed. And while police wasted precious time chasing a false lead, Emily's real killer remained free. And he was still out there. As the years passed and the investigation stalled, Emily Carter's family was left desperate for answers. They clung to every shred of hope, believing that someday, police would catch the monster who took their daughter's life. But not all the attention the case received was genuine. Enter Todd Mercer, a local man with no connection to Emily, but a sick obsession with inserting himself into tragic events. Todd was a serial liar, someone who thrived on attention, especially in cases that drew public sympathy. And for years, he tormented the Carter family with false leads, disturbing letters, and fabricated tips. One day, he would call claiming to have seen Emily with an unknown man before she vanished. Another time, he would tell police he overheard someone bragging about the murder in a bar. Each lead was a dead end. But the worst came when Todd sent an anonymous letter to Emily's mother. It contained graphic details about her daughter's final moments, descriptions of the crime that only the killer would know. Panicked, she immediately gave the letter to police. For a moment, it felt like they might finally have a break in the case. Investigators traced the letter back to Todd Mercer. But when confronted, he admitted he made the whole thing up. He had never met Emily Carter. He had no involvement in the crime. He just wanted to feel important. Police charged Todd with obstruction of justice, but the damage had been done. Emily's family had been forced to relive their trauma over and over again, all because of a man who wanted his 5 minutes of fame. And while Todd sat in a jail cell for a few months, the real killer, was still out there. For 3 decades, Emily Carter's murder remained unsolved. Her case file sat collecting dust, with police unable to do much more than revisit old interviews and retest weak evidence. Her family never gave up hope, but after 30 years of silence, the possibility of justice felt more and more distant. Then, in 2015, something unthinkable happened. A DNA hit. With modern advancements in forensic testing, the sample collected from Emily's body was reprocessed and finally entered into the FBI database. What happened next was something no one expected. A match appeared. The DNA belonged to a man named Richard Hale, a convicted felon who had never been on police radar in connection to Emily's murder. At the time of Emily's death, Hale was 22 years old, living just 2 towns over. His criminal record was disturbing. He had been arrested multiple times for domestic violence, battery, and attempted sexual assault. But somehow, in 1985, police had overlooked him entirely. Hale's DNA had entered the system after a recent arrest for domestic abuse, which finally connected him to Emily's case. For the first time in 30 years, detectives had a real suspect. Emily's mother, Linda Carter, received a late-night call from police. "We found him," they told her. Her hands shook as she listened. After decades of grief, uncertainty, and dead ends, Emily's killer had finally been identified. Now there was only one thing left to do: bring him to justice. For 30 years, the name Richard Hale had never appeared in the investigation. Now, the DNA evidence told a different story. Hale was 55 years old when police connected him to Emily Carter's murder. He had spent most of his life in and out of jail, but in 1985, when Emily was killed, he was just 22 years old and a complete unknown to law enforcement. That was no longer the case. Police quickly uncovered a disturbing pattern of violence. 1990, arrested for assaulting his girlfriend in a parking lot. 1993, charged with breaking into an ex-girlfriend's house and threatening her with a knife. 1999, arrested for attempted sexual assault, but the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. 2007, convicted of domestic battery, serving only 18 months in prison. And the worst part? He had been released early from nearly every sentence he had ever served. Hale had never been linked to Emily's case because, at the time, police focused on local suspects. But in 1985, he had been living just 12 miles away, working as a mechanic at an auto shop near Cedar Ridge. His ex-girlfriends later described him as having a violent temper, frequently obsessing over true crime cases, and bragging about how easy it was to get away with things. Despite his history, no one suspected he was a murderer. Until now. With DNA evidence placing him at the crime scene, police had everything they needed. And on October 2nd, 2015, Richard Hale was arrested at his home in Dallas, Texas. After 30 years, the police finally had their man. But the fight for justice wasn't over yet, because Richard Hale wasn't going down without a deal. On October 2nd, 2015, after 3 decades of unanswered questions, police arrived at Richard Hale's home in Dallas, Texas. The now 55-year-old man answered the door with a blank expression, unaware that his past had finally caught up to him. "Richard Hale, you're under arrest for the 1985 murder of Emily Carter." For a moment, he didn't react. Then, as officers placed him in handcuffs, he muttered just 2 words. "It's over." Once in custody, Hale refused to talk. He denied knowing Emily Carter, claiming the DNA evidence was wrong, but detectives knew better. With overwhelming forensic proof, prosecutors prepared for a long trial. But then, Richard Hale made an offer. He agreed to plead guilty to Emily's murder, but only if he could avoid the death penalty. After years of waiting, Emily's family faced a painful decision. They wanted justice, but more than anything, they wanted closure. In 2016, Richard Hale was sentenced to 80 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. Emily's mother, Linda Carter, sat in the courtroom as the judge read the verdict. Her daughter's killer would never walk free again. But even as he was led away in handcuffs, one question remained. Why did it take 30 years to catch him? And could Emily's murder have been prevented? Richard Hale was finally behind bars, but for many, the damage had already been done. For 30 years, Emily Carter's family had lived with grief, uncertainty, and endless questions. And they weren't the only ones who suffered. One name that was never forgotten was Brian Lawson, the man wrongfully suspected of Emily's murder for years. Brian had been 19 when police first questioned him, and despite being completely innocent, his life was forever changed. Friends and neighbors distanced themselves from him. Potential employers turned him away. Even after his DNA cleared him, the damage had been done. "You can't erase 3 decades of people looking at you like a murderer," he later said in an interview. "I lost everything for a crime I didn't commit, and I never even got an apology." Emily's mother, Linda Carter, was also left with a bitter truth, that her daughter's killer should have been caught sooner. Richard Hale had a long history of violence, yet he had been released early from prison multiple times. If the justice system had kept him behind bars, would Emily still be alive? How many other victims had suffered because Hale was allowed to walk free? Linda couldn't help but wonder, could this have been prevented? For Emily's family, there was relief in knowing Hale would die in prison. But justice delayed isn't the same as justice served. And for them, no sentence could bring Emily back. Her case became a haunting example of how one failure, one missed opportunity, can lead to irreversible tragedy. Emily Carter's story is a tragic reminder that justice, when delayed, often feels incomplete. For 30 years, her family waited, hoping for answers, watching leads go cold and suspects go free. Her killer, Richard Hale, should have been caught decades earlier. He had a history of violent assaults, yet he slipped through the cracks, repeatedly released, given second chances he never deserved. It makes you wonder, how many times has the system failed like this? How many other criminals are out there, their past offenses ignored, waiting for their next victim? And most disturbingly, how many innocent people, like Brian Lawson, have had their lives destroyed over false accusations? What do you think? Should law enforcement be held accountable for wrongful suspicion, like in Brian's case? Should violent offenders like Hale be monitored more closely after release? Could this crime have been prevented if the justice system had acted sooner? These aren't just hypothetical questions. They're real concerns that affect cases across the world. Emily Carter's name deserves to be remembered. She wasn't just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a bright young girl whose life was stolen far too soon. And while her family finally got justice, one fact remains: justice should never take 30 years. Backhand and expointing right, what are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments. Police Scarlight help keep stories like Emily's alive. Subscribe to the True Crime Family for more chilling real-life cases. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Like and share this video to help spread awareness. Because sometimes, justice is only served when people refuse to forget. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and take care.